Before we begin, it's important to note that today's stories address complex themes of mental health and human behavior. To treat these cases with the responsibility they deserve, I have integrated cultural and clinical notes throughout the video. These brief segments will provide scientific context and informative tools to help us better understand the nature of psychopathy, distinguishing myth from medical reality. Enjoy the analysis. Psychologists of Reddit. When did you realize your patient was a psychopath? As a clinical psychologist, you learn to trust your instincts as much as the manuals. I saw a 42-year-old patient, let's call him Elias. He arrived at my office with an impeccable presence, a tailored suit, a soft voice, and a charisma that, in any other setting, would have made him look like a natural-born leader. He had been referred after 2 failed divorces, both marked by accusations of emotional abuse. His reason for seeking consultation was, in his own words, an inability to connect emotionally and the feeling that people constantly misinterpreted his intentions. At first, Elias was a textbook patient, polite, insightful, apparently aware of his flaws, but something didn't fit. There was an almost robotic precision in his words, a theatrical air when he described pain or joy, but he always did it from a distance. He never said, "I felt hurt." It was always, "People would expect someone in my position to feel hurt." In one session, I decided to dig deeper and asked him to describe the saddest moment of his life. He paused, smiled slightly, and recited a story about the death of his dog when he was 12 years old. The narrative structure was perfect. The details, the timing, even a slight tremor in his voice that suggested vulnerability. But his eyes were completely still, dry and fixed on me, as if he were watching a mirror to see if his performance was having the desired effect. The moment of truth came when, with terrifying tranquility, he admitted, "I know what empathy looks like, doctor. I know what people want to hear when someone is suffering. I've practiced it enough to be convincing." What finally sealed the diagnosis was a casual confession about his work environment. He described how he manipulated a female coworker into resigning, subtly undermining her confidence for months, only to fake deep concern when she finally collapsed in the office. "It wasn't personal," he said without a shred of guilt. "It was strategic. She was in my way." There was no remorse, no understanding of the gravity of his actions. For Elias, human beings were not people with feelings, they were obstacles or tools. After an exhaustive evaluation, the diagnosis confirmed my suspicions: antisocial personality disorder with strong psychopathic traits. Cultural note. It is important to clarify that in formal clinical practice, the term psychopath does not usually appear as an official diagnosis in reports. Instead, mental health professionals are guided by the DSM-5 Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, where these behaviors are classified under antisocial personality disorder, ASPD. While the DSM-5 is the gold standard in the United States and much of Latin America, many countries and international organizations also use the ICD-11 International Classification of Diseases from the World Health Organization. The difference is technical but fundamental. While ASPD focuses heavily on antisocial behaviors, breaking the law, fighting, irresponsibility, psychopathy refers more to interpersonal and affective traits, lack of remorse, superficial charm, and manipulation. An individual can have ASPD without being a psychopath, but almost all psychopaths meet the criteria for ASPD. I have practiced as a clinical psychologist for nearly 20 years. I have treated profiles of all kinds, from violent criminals to victims of deep trauma, but there is one case that, after all this time, has never allowed me to be at peace." He was a young man, exceptionally charming and with impeccable oratory skills. He came to therapy not of his own free will, but at the insistence of his partner, citing alleged communication problems. However, from the very first session, my instinct set off every alarm. He answered every question with a perfect magnetic smile, as if even accounts of conflict or pain were simple, amusing anecdotes to him. As time went on, the facade of relationship issues crumbled to reveal an absolute void. There was no empathy. He didn't show an ounce of remorse for behaviors that had emotionally devastated those around him. He spoke of manipulation as if it were a rational and necessary tactic. On one occasion, with a logic that chilled my blood, he told me, "If you are capable of convincing someone to do something, isn't it their fault for being so naive and falling for the game?" The turning point occurred when, with no trace of emotion, he confessed to having indirectly triggered a former partner's suicide attempt. He didn't do it out of anger or revenge. He wanted to see how far she would go if he dropped certain calculated comments during her moments of greatest vulnerability. The most terrifying part is that, after the event, he wrote everything that happened in a notebook to analyze the woman's reactions as if it were a field study. There was never a formal crime. He always danced on the razor's edge. His acts were legally gray, but morally atrocious. Having no criminal record, and representing no imminent danger of physical aggression according to legal standards, we could do nothing but continue with the sessions. I remember leaving one particular session with a thought that haunted me for weeks. I don't want him to die, but I don't want him free in society either. That feeling of absolute helplessness, of being in front of someone dangerously lucid and aware of their power to destroy lives without breaking a single penal code, is a weight I still carry with me. Cultural note. In forensic and clinical psychology, we often distinguish between the criminal psychopath and the successful psychopath, or integrated individual. These people possess high levels of what Robert Hare classifies as Factor 1 on the Psychopathy checklist, revised PCL-R. While Factor 2 focuses on impulsivity and delinquency, Factor 1 refers to interpersonal and affective traits. Glibness, a grandiose sense of self-worth, pathological lying, and a total lack of empathy. Because they lack the impulsivity of the common criminal, Factor 1 psychopaths often occupy positions of power in corporations or politics. From a neurological standpoint, research suggests these individuals have reduced functional connectivity between the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, where guilt and empathy are processed, and the amygdala. This biological disconnect allows them to make purely strategic decisions without the emotional break that others experience when seeing someone suffer. Back then, I was working at a low-security mental health clinic. I was assigned the case of a young man in his early 20s who had been referred for an anger management program. From our first interaction, his profile puzzled me. Unlike other patients with impulsivity issues, he was always calm. He was polite, eloquent, and possessed a natural charm that made conversation easy. He spoke of his past fights, his brushes with authority, and his time in juvenile detention with a strange detachment, as if he were reviewing a movie he had just seen. What began to disturb me was his obsession with control. He didn't boast about his strength, but rather about his ability to move people at his will. He described incidents where he helped his friends avoid trouble by manipulating third parties into taking the blame. At first, I thought they were just youthful exaggerations, but the precision of the details was surgical. He explained, even the exact tone of voice and the pauses he used to convince someone that they were solely responsible for an error. While narrating these moments of dominance, a small smile would appear on his face, but it was a smile that died on his lips. His eyes remained cold, watching me, evaluating my reaction. The point of no return occurred on a gray afternoon when, with startling casualness, he described how he had injured a neighbor's dog because it wouldn't stop barking. "I didn't feel anything, doctor," he told me, almost in a polite, apologetic tone. "I just wanted silence." In his voice, there was no trace of remorse, sadism, or hatred. It was pure curiosity. He looked at me as if I were a specimen under a microscope, waiting to see if his confession managed to alter my professionalism. What truly chilled my blood was not the act of cruelty itself, but how little it affected him. To him, the suffering of the animal or any other person was simply a bothersome noise that had to be eliminated to restore his personal order. After that session, I sought a consultation with a senior psychiatrist. We agreed that he presented the classic traits of psychopathy, superficial charm, a total lack of empathy, manipulative behavior, and an extremely shallow emotional response. We recommended an in-depth psychological evaluation and requested his transfer to a higher-level care facility. Years have passed, but I can still see that empty smile in my mind. Cultural note. In clinical psychology, a fundamental concept for understanding cases like this is ego-syntonicity. Most mental health conditions, such as depression or anxiety, are ego-dystonic, meaning the patient perceives their symptoms as something foreign, distressing, and painful. However, in antisocial personality disorders and psychopathy, traits are ego-syntonic. This means the individual feels in total harmony with their way of being. They do not see their lack of empathy or their cruelty as a problem to be healed, but rather as a competitive advantage over others. To an ego-syntonic psychopath, the world is divided into predators and prey. Therefore, they do not seek help to change, but often attend therapy only when forced by third parties or to refine their social camouflage skills. This characteristic makes treatment extremely difficult. Since there is no internal suffering regarding their actions, there is no real motivation for behavioral change. Clinical intervention at these levels focuses more on risk management and societal protection than on emotional rehabilitation, as one cannot teach feeling to a brain that lacks the biological connections necessary to process remorse. I was conducting a routine evaluation at a juvenile detention center when I met a 15-year-old boy whose behavior put me on high alert from the very first second. The session began in a protocol-ary manner, reviewing his history and background. He answered each of my questions with impeccable courtesy, but with an unsettling detachment, as if he were reciting a script he had memorized and perfected for weeks. When we reached the critical point, and I asked him what he felt regarding his actions, which included a violent assault, he held my gaze without blinking. With startling calmness, he told me, "I don't think I feel anything. I know I should feel something. That's what people expect, right?" It wasn't simply the absence of remorse that disturbed me. It was his analytical awareness of that absence. He wasn't confused by his lack of empathy. He simply accepted it as a technical fact. He perfectly understood the emotional responses society expected of him, but he chose not to imitate them unless it served a specific purpose in his personal strategy. Later, he described how he manipulated his peers and teachers for fun, detailing methods that were disturbingly methodical for someone his age. At the end of the session, I immediately sought out my supervisor. We agreed that we needed to initiate a comprehensive evaluation for possible antisocial personality traits. That boy wasn't a chaotic youth or one overwhelmed by his hormones. He was cold, calculated, and possessed a chilling self-awareness. It was the only time in my career that I decided to end a session early, driven solely by a survival instinct I couldn't silence. Cultural note: in clinical psychiatry, antisocial personality disorder (ASPD) cannot be formally diagnosed until an individual turns 18. This is because the adolescent brain, specifically the prefrontal cortex, is still undergoing a massive process of maturation and synaptic pruning. However, when a youth displays this level of hollow lucidity, professionals look for indicators of early onset psychopathy. A key indicator is the patient's mention of manipulating others for fun. This points to a phenomenon called low cortical arousal. These individuals have a biological need for high-intensity stimuli, such as conflict or risk, just to feel a normal level of brain stimulation. For them, social interaction is not an emotional exchange, but a game of strategy where boredom is the only real enemy. Identifying these traits before the age of 18 is vital for juvenile justice systems, as it allows them to differentiate between a youth who can be rehabilitated and one whose personality structure is already oriented towards social predation. As a psychologist, you think you're prepared for crises, but nothing prepares you for the impact of domestic manipulation within your own family. This weekend, I received an emergency call my brother-in-law was threatening to commit suicide. I arrived at his house terrified, expecting to find a body, only to find him sitting calmly, drinking whiskey. He thought it was funny. While I was shaking, phone in hand, ready to call the sheriff, he just smiled. As I walked in, the manipulation escalated. He tried to convince me that my sister was exaggerating and that he had never spoken about harming himself. I almost believed him, until she arrived and read the texts, a classic, meticulous suicide note, 20 minutes long, where he said goodbye to his children and spoke about his destiny, only to then turn off his phone and generate absolute panic. When we confronted him with the physical evidence of his own messages, his reaction wasn't shame, but indignation. He began to say he was in trouble and reprimanded my sister for involving his parents. When I suggested therapy, his response was a declaration of absolute grandiosity. He said that no mortal man had the right to tell him who he was. It was in that moment that I understood the magnitude of the void. There is no empathy, there is no remorse, only an ego that is willing to burn the emotional world of his family just to be the center of attention. Cultural note: in clinical literature, self-harm threats can be categorized by their function. Instrumental suicide communication is distinguished from typical suicidal ideation because its primary goal is not the end of life, but obtaining a specific response from the environment, such as attention, avoiding a consequence, or exercising power. This type of behavior is frequently associated with grandiose narcissism, a personality trait characterized by sense of superiority manifested in the rejection of professional or mortal authority, externalization of guilt, a tendency to blame others for the consequences of one's own actions, deficit in punishment processing, a low physiological reactivity to social conflict. From a neuropsychological perspective, the lack of response to others' distress in this case, the family's terror, is linked to low activation in the anterior cingulate cortex and the anterior insula, key regions for effective resonance. When these areas do not respond adequately, the individual can process others' pain as a logical variable or a negotiation tool, but not as a stimulus that generates personal discomfort, which facilitates the persistence of manipulative behaviors even when confronted with reality. I started my career in forensic psychology, but I decided to walk away from that world after being stabbed and assaulted several times by adult patients. Seeking a safer environment, I began working with children and adolescents. It was there that I met Sarah, an 8-year-old girl who would become the first case I marked in my notes as pure, early-onset psychopathy. Sarah came from a stable and dedicated family. Her parents were regulated and committed people. They had been through several therapists who failed to understand her because Sarah didn't show typical behavioral problems. She wasn't impulsive, she didn't lose her temper, and she didn't have tantrums. On the contrary, Sarah was attentive, meticulous, and always had a plan. Her history was textbook, a long list of mutilated dolls and injured animals. What made her unique was her ability to avoid trouble. She was a master at convincing other children, usually younger than her, to commit offenses for her. I managed to break the ice using psychometric tests. I had a fairly expensive evaluation booklet in front of me, worth about $200. While staring me straight in the eyes, Sarah began tearing out the pages one by one, very slowly. I kept my poker face. She asked me, "What are you going to do about it?" I replied with total indifference. "Nothing." She continued until she admitted she was surprised I didn't react. I told her, "It's not my notebook, I just work here." Only then did she stop. I spent 9 hours with her, and the pattern was the same. The most uncomfortable thing was her constant gaze. She tried to read every micro gesture on my face, frustrated, because my lack of expression didn't give her the information she needed to manipulate me. She observed her parents the same way, as if they were research subjects. Child Protective Services were involved, but no one knew what to do with a child who didn't break the rules loudly, but rather in a calculated manner. Shortly after, her family moved across the country to a heavily forested area. I remember her father joking with a deep sadness, "At least the animals over there will fight back." They looked terrified of their own daughter. 6 months after their move, one of the most devastating wildfires in the region's history destroyed entire towns. To this day, I wonder if Sarah was the one who lit the first match. Cultural note. In child psychiatry, this is known as proactive aggression, as opposed to reactive aggression. While most children with behavioral issues act out of impulsivity or lack of emotional control reaction, the early psychopathic profile shows cold, planned, and goal-oriented aggression proactive. From a developmental perspective, these children exhibit low cortisol reactivity and a blunted response from the autonomic nervous system toward punishment. The fascination with fire and animal cruelty in childhood, combined with the manipulation of others to avoid consequences, are indicators of a personality structure that does not seek social connection, but rather dominance over the environment. Science suggests that in these cases, the brain processes human interaction, not through empathy, but through cognitive theory of mind. This is used as a tool to read the weaknesses of others and exploit them for personal gain, often without the adults around them realizing the magnitude of the danger until a catastrophe occurs. As a clinical psychologist with experience in the British health system, I am concerned about the amount of misinformation circulating on these topics. It is imperative to clarify something. Psychopathy is not a formal diagnosis, and in many parts of the world, it isn't even used in clinical practice. Often, in forums like this, people with personality disorders are labeled as if they were inherently monsters, but many professionals question the validity and utility of these labels. The idea that a personality is disordered suggests that there is something intrinsically broken in the human being, which only increases shame and stigma. While I understand that for some, receiving a name for their experience provides comfort and clarity, We cannot ignore that these diagnoses are often inconsistent. It is very common for 3 doctors to give 3 different diagnoses to the same patient. Today, there is a growing movement that prefers to understand these difficulties not as manufacturing flaws, but as responses to complex trauma. What we call antisocial traits are often survival mechanisms forged in environments of abuse or extreme neglect. Even in forensic services, following a crime, it is crucial to consider the context and the individual's life history. By reducing such complex human behaviors to labels like psychopath, we not only promote misunderstandings, but also feed narratives that dehumanize those who already suffer from the most severe mental difficulties. Behind every monster in these stories, there is usually a story of fracture that the system failed to see in time. Cultural note. In contemporary psychology, there is an intense debate between the traditional biomedical model and the trauma-informed approach. Many symptoms historically attributed to psychopathy or antisocial personality disorder are being reinterpreted under the framework of complex post-traumatic stress disorder, CPTSD. CPTSD develops after prolonged exposure to traumas from which there is no escape, such as childhood abuse or neglect. This causes structural changes in the brain. Amygdala hyperactivation, the fear center, is always on, which can manifest as an apparent coldness or emotional disconnection, dissociation to stop feeling pain. Hippocampal atrophy. This makes it difficult to regulate memory and emotions. Prefrontal cortex disconnection, which explains impulsivity or a lack of consideration for social norms. The biopsychosocial model proposes that we are not born damaged, but that our biology interacts with our environment. This perspective is vital for reducing stigma, understanding that antisocial behavior is, in many cases, a psychological armor that became permanent. By changing the question from "what is wrong with you" to "what happened to you," psychology seeks not only to label, but to understand and offer a real path toward repair and social integration. After analyzing these files, it's vital to put into perspective what it truly means to face these personality structures in the real world. Modern psychology offers us 4 fundamental truths we must understand. First, the term psychopath has practically fallen out of use within formal clinical settings. Today, we prefer to speak of antisocial personality disorder or specific callous unemotional traits. The reason is simple. The word psychopath is generic and often confused with narcissism. While they may share traits, not every individual with psychopathic traits is a narcissist. Their motivations and internal structures can be very different. Second, you don't always need a degree in psychology to sense that something is wrong. Our brains are evolutionarily designed to pick up on microsignals that our conscious mind ignores. That gut feeling or the knot in your stomach during a first encounter is often your alert system processing subconscious information. However, while instinct is a guide, only professional training can diagnose and treat, as our personal biases often make us see shadows where there are none. Third, there are many more people with psychopathic traits than we imagine, and the vast majority live productive and peaceful lives. In fact, some theorists suggest that these profiles have been a necessary evolutionary element. We need people capable of emotionally disconnecting to make cold decisions in extreme crisis situations, high-risk surgeries, or missions where empathy could be an obstacle to the group's survival. Finally, we must remember that almost all of us, in moments of crisis, exhaustion, or extreme pain, can exhibit symptoms that look like a personality disorder. But there is a massive difference for us. These are fleeting moments for the true disorder. It is a permanent way of existing. The disorder is not a momentary emotion, it is the very structure of the building. Cultural note: the spectrum and adaptive psychopathy. Contemporary psychology has begun to view personality not as a list of the healthy and the sick, but as a continuous spectrum. Under this view, antisocial traits exist in varying degrees across the entire population. One of the most fascinating theories is that of adaptive psychopathy. This suggests that certain traits such as charm, fearlessness, stress resilience, and hyperfocus are extremely valuable in specific professions. Studies have shown a high prevalence of these traits among surgeons, pilots, CEOs, and members of special forces. The difference between a productive individual and a dangerous one isn't necessarily the trait itself, but the context and self-control. While the criminal psychopath uses their traits to exploit others, the individual with adaptive psychopathic traits can use them to perform tasks that require a technical coldness that saves lives or solves problems most of us would find emotionally paralyzing.